Inside America's most isolated prisons, the secret war within. There are prisons, and then there are cages within cages. Imagine a place where sunlight barely touches your skin, where the silence is so deep you start to question whether you even exist, where the war isn't between guards and inmates, but inside the human mind itself. This is not just prison. This is isolation perfected. And tonight we're going deep inside America's most isolated prisons to uncover the secret war within, the cage within the cage. Most people think a prison is bars, guards, and yards filled with men in orange jumpsuits, but hidden within these massive complexes are smaller worlds, tiny chambers, where inmates are buried alive in silence. ADX Florence, Pelican Bay's SHU, Louisiana's Angola farm, and New York's infamous Rikers Island. They all share one thing: isolation units designed to break the body without ever laying a hand. For 23 hours a day, some of America's most dangerous and sometimes most vulnerable men and women live alone in concrete boxes, no phone, no touch, no escape. Psychologists call it segregated housing. Inmates call it the hole. But to those who have lived it, it's something far darker, a war inside the mind, the birth of isolation. The idea of locking someone away in total silence isn't new. The very first American prisons in the 1800s were built on this philosophy. Back then, reformers thought that if you left a man alone with only his thoughts and his Bible, he would repent. They called it the Pennsylvania system. But within a few years, reports surfaced, prisoners going blind, talking to themselves, banging their heads against the walls, losing their grip on reality. Instead of repentance, isolation bred madness. Yet the idea never died. Instead, it evolved, becoming harsher, colder, and more controlled. Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, if solid. Every confinement had a crown jewel. It would be here, ADX Florence. Known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, ADX is America's most secure federal prison. Built in 1994, it was designed to house the so-called worst of the worst: terrorists, gang leaders, spies, and violent escape artists. Inside, every cell is a self-contained trap by 12 feet, a concrete slab for a bed, a steel sink and toilet, a small slit of a window angled so you can only see sky. For 23 hours a day, inmates sit in these boxes. No direct human contact, no physical programs. Even their recreation is done alone inside a concrete pen. Former warden Robert Hood once said it best: "It's not built for rehabilitation. It's built for one thing: to kill a man's soul. The war no one sees." But here's the real secret. Isolation doesn't just punish the prisoner. It creates a war inside every mind that endures it. Hallucinations, depression, violent outbursts, suicidal thoughts. One former inmate described it like this: after a while, the walls start to close in. You hear voices that aren't there. You start talking back, and that's when you realize you're not the same person anymore. For some, this is the true sentence: not 20 years, not life without parole, but life inside their own mind with no way out. Pelican Bay, the SHU within the storm. If ADX Florence is America's crown jewel of isolation, then Pelican Bay is the blueprint that changed everything. Opened in 1989, Pelican Bay was California's answer to a growing crisis of prison gangs. The Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Guerrilla family. Each of them wielded enormous power, controlling drugs, extortion, and even murders, both inside and outside the walls. The solution? The Security Housing Unit, known simply as the SHU. Inmates placed in the SHU spend 22 to 24 hours a day in windowless concrete cells. Their meals are delivered through a slot. Their only human contact is when officers cuff them for showers or yard time. And even then, yard time means pacing alone in a barren concrete pen, smaller than a parking space. The SHU wasn't just a place to house violent men. It became a weapon, a tool to dismantle entire gang networks, but it came with a price: the debrief or die dilemma. In California, to escape the SHU, inmates were often given only one choice: debrief. Debriefing meant snitching, telling investigators everything you knew about your gang: names, codes, operations, secrets. But in prison, being labeled a snitch is a death sentence. So men faced an impossible choice: stay in the SHU for years, even decades, alone in silence, or betray their brothers and risk being killed the moment they re-entered general population. I did 10 years in the SHU, 10 years of no touch, no voices, no nothing. They said I could get out if I told them everything about my gang, but in here, snitches don't live long. So I chose the cell. Hunger strikes uprising from the hole. By the 2000s, Pelican Bay's SHU population exploded. Thousands of men were locked away, many not for crimes committed behind bars, but simply for association. If investigators believed you were tied to a gang, even just through tattoos or reading material, you could be buried in the SHU indefinitely. The response: one of the largest coordinated prisoner protests in U.S. history. In 2011, thousands of inmates across California launched hunger strikes. They refused food, risking their lives to demand change. Their demands were simple: an end to indefinite solitary, fair hearings, basic human contact. Some nearly starved to death before the state was forced to respond. The world finally glimpsed what was happening inside the SU, and the debate over solitary confinement erupted into the open. Angola, the farm of broken souls. If Pelican Bay's SAU is a fortress of silence, Angola is a plantation of control. Built on former slave plantation land, Angola is America's largest maximum security prison. Over 6,000 men live here, many serving life without parole. They call it the farm. But Angola also hides its own isolation units. Places like Camp J. Camp J was notorious for its conditions: 23-hour lockdowns. No education, no programs, no chance of release. For decades, men described it as a prison inside a prison. And here the battle wasn't just against the system, it was against hope itself. In Camp J, time stops. You could scream and nobody would hear you. After a while, you stop screaming. The psychological toll. Across America's isolated prisons, one truth remains the same: the human brain is not built for this. Studies show, after just a few weeks, solitary confinement can cause severe anxiety and paranoia. After months, hallucinations, memory loss, and depression set in. After years, some never recover. Solitary confinement doesn't just punish the body, it rewires the mind. And in America, thousands of inmates live this reality every single day. Rikers Island, the Forgotten Tombs. If ADX Florence is the cage perfected, and Pelican Bay is the blueprint, then Rikers Island is something else entirely. Chaos, violence, and isolation colliding in one place. Home to New York City's jail system, Rikers isn't a prison for the convicted. It's a holding pen for those awaiting trial or serving short sentences. Yet inside its walls, solitary confinement has become a weapon of control. In Rikers, solitary confinement is called punitive segregation, but many inmates know it by another name: the Bing. Cells the size of a walk-in closet, fluorescent lights that never turn off, and time that crawls so slowly, minutes feel like days. Kalief Browder, a story that shook the nation. Perhaps no story reveals the hidden cost of solitary more than that of Kalief Browder. At just 16 years old, Kalief was accused of stealing a backpack. He was sent to Rikers Island, unable to post bail. He would spend over 3 years inside, 2 of them in solitary confinement. Kalief was never convicted of a crime, yet in isolation he endured beatings, starvation, and psychological torment. When he was finally released, the damage had already been done. At 22 years old, Kalief Browder took his own life. Kalief's story ignited national outrage, forcing America to ask, what happens when you place a child in the world's harshest cage, the secret war at Rikers? But Kalief wasn't alone. Just thousands have passed through Rikers' solitary wings, many suffering quietly, with no headlines to carry their names. Behind those doors, another war rages, gangs pressuring recruits even in isolation, guards abusing their power, using segregation as punishment, inmates turning on themselves, cutting, swallowing razors, screaming into the void. You forget how to talk. I heard voices every night. After a while, you just want it to stop. It's not just punishment, it's survival. And at Rikers, survival comes at a cost most never recover from: the lawsuits and the lies. Over the years, lawsuits have flooded New York's courts, families demanding accountability for what happens behind Rikers' walls. Reports revealed inmates locked in solitary far longer than regulations allowed. Teens and people with mental illness placed in isolation despite bans. Guards falsifying records to hide abuse. Each lawsuit pulls back the curtain on a system stretched to its breaking point. Yet each settlement, each promise of reform, seems to vanish like smoke. The cages remain, the doors still slam shut, and the war within continues. The national crisis. Rikers isn't unique. Across America, solitary confinement has become the default solution to problems prison officials can't control. From California to Louisiana, from New York to Colorado, tens of thousands of inmates sit alone, day after day, year after year. Supporters say isolation keeps order, prevents violence, saves lives. But critics argue it's nothing less than psychological torture. Prolonged solitary confinement, beyond 15 days, constitutes torture. And yet in the land of the free, thousands of men and women have spent not 15 days, but 15 years in the hole, the prisoners of silence. Inside America's most isolated prisons are men whose names once dominated headlines: terrorists, spies, drug lords, murderers, each locked away, their voices swallowed by the walls. But behind the silence, their stories reveal how isolation breaks even the most notorious. The Unabomber, alone with his thoughts. Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, a Harvard-educated mathematician turned domestic terrorist. His bombs killed 3 and injured dozens in a nationwide campaign. In 1998, he was sentenced to life without parole and sent to ADX Florence. For decades, he lived alone in silence, his only outlet, letters. In hundreds of pages, he debated politics, science, and his own radical beliefs. But beneath the words lay the toll of isolation. I hear voices telling me to do things. It is impossible to escape them. In June 2023, after nearly 25 years in solitary, Kaczynski took his own life. Proof that even the coldest minds can collapse when the war within grows louder than the walls outside. El Chapo, the king in a box. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, leader of Mexico's Sinaloa cartel. A man who once escaped prisons through secret tunnels and bribed armies. But in 2019, after his conviction in New York, even El Chapo faced America's isolation machine. At ADX, El Chapo is cut off from his empire. No phones, no visitors beyond his lawyers. Every letter he writes is monitored. Every word he speaks is recorded. For a man who once commanded thousands, the isolation is the sharpest punishment of all. ADX is the only place that can keep him. He will never escape again. The gang lords in the hole. Not every name is known to the public, but inside Pelican Bay, Angola, and Rikers, entire gang empires are run from behind the door. Even in isolation, communication finds a way. Smuggled kites, hidden signals, lawyers carrying coded messages, and prison officials know it. Which is why solitary confinement has become not just punishment, but containment of influence. Still, for every empire dismantled, another rises. Isolation cannot erase power. It only moves the battlefield inside the human mind. The madness of long-term isolation. What happens when months become years? When years stretch into decades? Some prisoners describe phantom voices, entire conversations with people who aren't there. Others report seeing shadows crawl across the walls, or hearing footsteps in empty hallways. The human brain is wired for connection. When deprived, it begins to create its own stimuli. Hallucinations aren't just possible, they're inevitable. For some, the line between punishment and torture disappears, and the war within becomes a life sentence of its own.